So this is the recording, the notes recording for chapter 14, and it goes over the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. So we'll start by going over the spinal cord and orient ourselves just a little bit. I've drawn a picture here where you can see the meninges, the coverings that cover the spinal cord, and also the brain as well, with dura mater right here being the most superficial that covers the spinal cord. And remember also the brain, and then arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater. Okay, remember within this space right here is where CSF fluid, the cerebral spinal fluid, circulates. So looking at this column or this section of spinal cord, we can see some different structures. We can see some nerves coming out of the spinal cord, and some internal structures as well. So if I put a star right here, I want you to know that this is the white matter. And then, let me get a different color. This, with this gray star, is the gray matter. So what is the difference between the white matter and the gray matter? Well, white matter holds the myelinated axon. So remember that myelin is the sort of fatty insulation that surrounds the axons, and the white matter of the spinal cord consists of, I guess, basically tracts of axons running up and down the spinal cord, the myelinated axons. And then the gray matter consists mostly of unmyelinated axons. Okay, and cell bodies. Okay. Here in green, I've drawn some interneurons, and they take messages within the brain and the spinal cord, and so they are part of the central nervous system. So remember that we have two categories here. We have the central nervous system and then the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system consists of sensory neurons that bring information into the central nervous system, and efferent, or we'll say motor neurons that take information from the central nervous system to the periphery, or to a target cell or effector. So let's talk about the different branches that we have of those. So if we were to draw this, I drew here in blue the sensory, taking information into this nerve tract right here. So hopefully you learned the different parts of this. So this would be the posterior side of the spinal cord, and then this would be the anterior side. Okay, so a sensory neuron would sense information, or sensory receptors, and then take information into the spinal cord through its certain structures. So what structures do we have here? This would be the spinal nerve, and then it takes it down the posterior aspect. You see the sort of bulging out area? That has a special name. They call that the posterior, or sometimes dorsal, root ganglion. So this right here, let me draw it over here, is the posterior, sometimes referred to as dorsal root ganglion. So what is a ganglion? Well, a ganglion is basically a bundle of cell bodies, or a gang of cell bodies. And that's exactly what's within that bulging area of the nerve tract, a bundle of cell bodies, specifically of sensory nerve cell bodies. And then they're taking information into the spinal cord. It goes through the white matter and then into an area of gray matter. So it is on the posterior side. So it is the posterior gray horn. This is the posterior, I'm going to abbreviate, gray horn. And then it's taken up by an interneuron, taken to the brain, and then back down through the spinal cord. And then it's taken out to the periphery through a motor neuron. So if it's taken to, say, a skeletal muscle, which is voluntary, then it is a somatic motor neuron. And it just follows the same path. And this would be an anterior root. And through this anterior root, it takes the message in this direction and then comes out through the spinal nerve. You see how both sensory and somatic motor neurons pass, or axons pass through the spinal nerve to our skeletal muscle there. Then we have visceral motor neurons, sometimes referred to as the autonomic. It's taking the message from the spinal cord, from the anterior side of the spinal cord. Typically they're found within this region right here, and I draw it better in chapter 15 lecture notes, and that's called I'll draw it up this way, the lateral horn, lateral gray horn. Most of them are found within the lateral gray horn. And it's taking this message down through the anterior root of this, and then towards this little bulging out area, which I talk about in chapter 15, and then out through the spinal nerve to its effector. And remember, those effectors can be cardiac, smooth muscle, or glands. Okay? So hopefully some of these structures are ringing a bell for you. I think the only ones I didn't label here were the anterior gray horn and I think the posterior root. So hopefully that's just review from lab. Okay. In this picture, I've broken it down in even more for you, so, and color coordinated it for you so that you could see the areas of the gray horn in which sensory enters and which motor exits. Remember, this is posterior and this is anterior. This is the gray matter and this is the white matter. And remember, the difference is white matter has myelinated axons, whereas the gray matter is more or less the collection of cell bodies. Okay, mostly cell bodies that are and neurons, interneurons that are unmyelinated. Okay, so I guess we could write it like this, if it helps. White is myelinated. And then gray is unmyelinated. Okay. So in this picture, it's from your book, you can see what's called funiculus. A funiculus is a bundle of nerve fibers that are enclosed in connective tissue, and most of them are found within the white matter of the spinal cord. And they're just basically bundles of axons. And in this picture we can follow one of the pathways of these nerve tracts through the spinal cord and actually up into the brain. So it starts down here, And you see this is the posterior side. So this is a sensory nerve axon that's taking information up through a specific tract in the spinal cord, and then as it moves further up, and this is in the medulla oblongata, it's traveling through interneurons and then all the way up into a part of the brain. So this right here is actually white matter, this is gray matter, and it's traveling all the way up to this point right here, and it says the primary somatosensory cortex. So that's the sensory pathway that a nerve would actually take through one of these funiculus. Okay. So this picture shows the principal motor pathways. The one that we were looking at before was talking about the sensory pathways. And we can see the different funiculus, the tracts that hold the axons. And these are tracts that hold motor axons. So they're taking messages away from the central nervous system after they leave the spinal cord. So we have basically two types, two categories, either direct or indirect. And typically these use two motor neurons, an upper and a lower, to do this. So we have direct, which are sometimes called corticospinal, and we see here that right here is the lateral corticospinal direct tract, and it helps with distal muscles and movement of the limbs. And then we also have an anterior corticospinal tract, funiculus, down here, of course, on the anterior side. And we have these on both sides of the spinal cord, so here and also here. And the anterior corticospinal tract deals with proximal muscles, particularly the axial muscles. Then the indirect has either lateral pathways or medial pathways. The lateral pathways, specifically the ruberospinal tract, deals with precise, discrete movements and tone of flexor muscles. And we can see those here. And then also here. The medial pathway is a group of them. Reticulospinal, it's circled there in yellow. Reticular spinal pathway, medial pathway, it deals with or helps with trunk and proximal limb muscle tone. And then the tectospinal tract, funiculus, mediates reflexive sort of postural movement and also helps in response to visual and auditory stimulus. The vestibulospinal tract, medial pathway, supports posture and helps maintain balance of both the body and the head. And those are all three located within the medial pathway. So we also have that over on the other side as well. Remember, this is posterior and this is anterior. Okay, and these are axons contained within the spinal tract, within these little tracts called funiculus or funiculi. Okay. So in this picture, we're going to start talking about actual spinal nerves. And the spinal nerve, when it leaves the spinal cord, it's exiting through the vertebrae, through the intervertebral, that's the space right here highlighted in blue on both sides, intervertebral foramen. And the spinal nerve, remember, is where the sensory and motor neurons come together, and then they will split off, and some will go down the posterior side and some will go down the anterior side. Posterior typically takes care of the posterior, like the back, and the anterior is going to take care of anterior side, and including all of your guts and stuff, so your gastrointestinal tract and everything on the anterior side. And the R stands for rami. Okay, so the way that these are labeled, the cervical spinal nerves, you have 8 cervical spinal nerves. And the cervical spinal nerves are labeled, so for instance, you see here that C4, the vertebrae is C4 right here, and then the spinal nerve underneath it is C5. And then C5 vertebrae, the nerve underneath it is C6. And it continues this way until you get to T1. So since we only have 7 cervical vertebrae and 8 cervical spinal nerves, this trend of the numbers going, so like 6 and then 7, 7 then 8, can't continue. So then when we finally get to T1, the spinal nerve underneath it is also going to be T1. And then, for instance, then T2, the spinal nerve underneath it is going to be T2. Okay, so that's only that way for the cervical spinal nerves. So in this picture to the right, we have what's called the dermatome man. And you can see different lines here, and they're all labeled according to the spinal nerves. And it's showing us what those nerves are innervating. So the only one that I can really remember is T10, because T10, that's talking about thoracic spinal nerve 10, and it goes around all the way to the belly button, or the umbilicus. And if you have pain in that region, it can sometimes indicate appendicitis. So that's why I remember that one. So if you see a picture like this, it's a dermatome man. And if you have pain in this region, in T10, which is to the right of the belly button or the umbilicus, it can indicate appendicitis, because your appendix is located right here. And this is typically referred to as referred pain. It's perceived as visceral pain, like in your heart or in your appendix. So you can't really say, yeah, my heart is hurting, but it's in a general region. The nerve that is sensing that pain will sometimes cause pain in another region, and that's called referred pain. And it is because of these dermatomes, these regions in which the nerves transmit pain. The last thing that I would ask that you know for Chapter 14 is your nerve plexus. I'm only going to ask the ones that you have to know for lab, and some important nerves that are included within the plexus. So what is a nerve plexus? A nerve plexus is basically a braid of spinal nerves. And I drew a picture of the brachial plexus. It's a braid or a bundle of spinal nerves coming out of the spinal cord. And the brachial plexus includes C5 through T1, and they braid together or come together, and they even join across each other. And we also have the cervical plexus, which is C1 through C4, sometimes C5, and it includes the phrenic nerve. And sometimes you'll hear people say 3, 4, 5 stay alive, because we need the phrenic nerve, because it innervates the diaphragm. Without that, we cannot breathe. Also know the lumbar plexus, which includes L1 through L4. It includes the femoral nerve and the obturator nerve. And then also the sacral plexus, which is L4, spinal nerve L4 through S4, and includes the biggest nerve in your body, the sciatic nerve. Okay, so that's all I have for Chapter 14. Happy studying, guys.